Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. If you've ever faced a double barrel out of position and wondered whether that gutshot, flush draw, or even second pair was worth a check raise, this episode is for you. In this theory-packed episode, we'll break down solver insights from a classic single raise pot, button versus big blind on a king 9-8 flop with a brick turn. You'll learn how often you should be check raising the turn, which hands make the cut as profitable semi-bluffs, and why many players drastically overbluff spots like these, often with 0 EV or worse. This one's especially valuable for serious cash game players who want to build balanced turn strategies and avoid leaking equity by raising too many gut shots or folding too many second pair hands. With that said, here's Coach Weasel to break it all down. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. This is going to be a theory-based podcast episode. We're going to be thinking about the scenario where we face a double barrel as the cold caller OOP in a single raised heads-up pot. The title of the episode is Turn Check Raise Annotation. We're having a look at the continuing range and especially the check raising range on the turn. Now, I understand that this is a podcast. You don't necessarily need to be able to see anything in order to make the most of this theory episode, but it will be handy if you can keep a specific scenario in your head. And the scenario is as follows. We are the big blind cold caller OOP against a button 2.5x open. This is a cash game with 100 big blind effective stacks. The board texture is King 9-8. So that is the King of Spades, the 9 of Diamonds, and the 8 of Diamonds. That's mostly what you need to remember. With a cold caller out of position, King of Spades, 9 of Diamonds, 8 of Diamonds, we check and face a continuation bet on the flop. It's going to be 75% pot c-bet, although you don't need to really remember that. And then we face a second barrel on the turn. Now we will choose a specific turn card, but we're going to start off by thinking about how we should be playing on every possible turn card. Just want to assimilate some average data points to indicate how often we should be check raising when facing a second barrel. So we'll assume that we check again on the turn and the pre-flop aggressor fires a double barrel for 75% pot. And then we think about check raising to just over 3x. And if we ask a solver, the average frequency for the turn check raise is around about 8%. To give a rough idea of the cards that get check raised the most, they are cards that complete the straight and or put a double flush draw out there as a rough guide. Turn cards that are check raised the least, so we are talking frequencies under 2%, are going to be cards when the board pairs, for example, the king or the 9 or the 8, and turn cards where the diamond flush completes. So that's at the low end, pairing or flush completing turns. We have as low as 2% check raise against the turn barrel. And at the high end, even though we said the average was around about 8%, the most frequently raised turn is a 7 of spades that completes some straights and also puts the double flush draw out there. That's raised 12.5% of the time. So although we get an average raising frequency of about 8% on the turn, that's an average of the lowest at around 2% and the most frequently raised turn card, which is going to be above 12%. And of course, there are a whole bunch of turn cards in the middle. We're going to pick something somewhere around the middle just to get an average idea of how we should be playing. We are going to go with the 4 of hearts. So it doesn't really complete too much, but also it's not one of those cards that pairs the board or completes the diamond flush. And according to solver, we're going to have around about 6.5% raising frequency. So slightly below average on the 4 of hearts. So just to recap everything so far, we are the cold caller, out of the big blind against a button 2.5x open, flop texture, King of Spades, 9 of Diamonds, 8 of Diamonds. We check, we face 75% flop c-bet. We check again on the turn, which is the 4 of hearts, which many players would describe as a brick. And our opponent makes a double barrel for 75% pot. We're supposed to be check raising just under 7% of the time against the double barrel. One of our main objectives here should simply be to understand which types of hands are strong enough to check raise as a semi-bluff. Now, we may be aware of the fact that we have quite a number of straight draws on a King 9-8 texture with a 4 turn, and they wouldn't necessarily have all raised the flop, although some of them might. So we're left with a large number of gut shots. And a common question players might have when facing a second barrel OOP with something like the nut gutshot, could be queen 10, queen jack in this particular scenario. Should we continue against that? Some players do actually call out of position with their gutshot on a routine basis, citing implied odds as the reason for the call. Other players are aware that gutshots aren't really quite strong enough to check call again OOP, but they figure since they have equity, it's going to make sense to just check raise all of their nut gutshots. Now, a little bit of advice here on something like a king 9-8 flop with a 4 turn. If we were to check raise all combos of queen jack and queen 10, we would be drastically over bluffing in the spot. We would also be bluff raising too wide. When we take a look at solver output, all of our gut shots are folded against the 75% pot second barrel. They are simply straight up check folds. Now, it is true that we do continue with some gut shots, but they are purely combo gut shots. They are holdings like queen 10 of diamonds, which has the combo equity with the gut shot plus flush draw. If we take a look at something like queen jack offsuit, so the best possible gut shot, these hands are pure folded. Now, this is, of course, a very specific situation, and one of the features of this particular situation is there are OESDs possible. Usually what we find when we have both gut shots and OESDs, if we are going to continue with any type of straight draw equity, naturally the OESDs are going to get prioritized over the gut shots. So we don't want to say that we're always going to be check folding a gut shot OOP when facing a second barrel. There are going to be textures where the board is fairly dry. We don't have too much in the way of flush draws. We don't have any OESDs, for example. In those situations, we may find that a gut shot makes the cut as a turn check raise. Having said that, the general mentality here should be that if we have a gut shot out of position on the turn, regardless of the situation, the most common option is going to be folding that gut shot, not check raising it. And if you're currently following a strategy where you simply just automatically check raise the nut gut shot OOP on the turn because it's not quite strong enough to call, we will have a raising frequency that is significantly too high. Of course, that is somewhat a balanced concept. Maybe it doesn't matter if we're bluff raising too much. The more pressing issue here is that the average opponent is probably not folding enough where a gut shot's going to be a plus EV check raise. So in theory land, these hands are probably close to 0 EV in certain spots as check raises. But in practice, something like a nut gut shot often ends up being directly minus EV as a turn check raise unless our opponent has a fairly high fold turn c-bet to raise frequency. So let's think about some of the slightly stronger types of equity. For example, the OESD. And in this situation, we have combos of Jack 10, we have combos of 10-7, and combos of 7-6. Now, this may come as a surprise, but the majority of OESDs are folds against a double barrel. And if this seems alien to you, the idea of folding something like an OESD against a 75% pot double barrel, you perhaps actually need to recalibrate your understanding of how wide we can continue OP on the turn. In a lot of cases, OESDs don't get quite the right price against a 75% pot barrel. Maybe they get an okay price against a smaller sizing and could call more frequently, but the most common option with an OESD is simply to fold out of position on the turn. Having said that, the EV on a raise is going to be more or less 0. In other words, these hands can be used for balance considerations. So when we have a look at solver output, it takes hands like 6-7 for the low end of the OESD, 10-7, and Jack 10 OESD, and we'll semi-bluff check raise those some of the time. So as a general rule, OESDs will be strong enough to check raise bluff. It's just that they won't be super profitable, and we also don't want to do it all of the time, otherwise our check raise frequencies will get out of line. But they are at the very least candidates for continuing. When we take a look at the absolute strongest OESD, the Jack 10 offsuit, that's actually just about strong enough to check call against the second barrel as well. But since it's also mostly mixed into the folding range, that gives us a clue regarding the EV of a check call with Jack 10. Pretty much 0 EV. So although we have some implied odds, they're not going to be very good given that we still have to play the river out of position. It's going to be difficult to extract value when we hit. So if we can't even check call something like Jack 10 OESD profitably in this scenario, then as you can imagine, check calling something like a Queen 10 gut shot is just going to be donating money to our opponent. When we get to the flush draw category, we find that flush draws are mostly defended, although they do still fold at a high frequency. So if you're under the opinion that if we have a flush draw, we have to continue against the second barrel, that's just not true from a theoretical perspective. We are folding a good 30 to 40% of our flush draws according to the solver output. The ones that do continue, most of them are calls, and when they are calls, they're very often going to be a flush draw plus. What this means is we're either going to have a flush draw with ace high, we're going to have a flush draw with some kind of pair, for example, something like queen 4 suited that pairs the turn, or we're going to have some kind of combo draw. For example, we could have queen jack of diamonds for the flush draw, gut shot, combo equity. The rest fold, although it's worth noting that some of the weaker flush draws are actually mixed into the raising range. So just as we have some of the OESDs in the raising range, we also have some weaker flush draws in the raising range as well. But once again, these are mostly flush draw pluses. For example, we have things like 5-6 of diamonds. And although it's not very strong, it technically has the gut shot to go with it, can make the low end of the straight on a 7. That's actually mixed into the raising range with some frequency. So we can see in terms of the flush draw region, there are some of the weakest continues that are actually mixed into the raising range. So they are fairly similar strength to some of the OESDs we were check raising. But we also have some very strong combo type stuff. For example, we have hands like king 4 of diamonds, but realistically, these hands are just value hands. They're 2 pair, for example, in this case. So let's summarize the semi-bluff raising range. There is nothing in that range that is total garbage. There is no point where we should have a complete airball and decide to check raise the turn. So compared to what we may have check raised the flop with, that can involve some fairly speculative holdings. Whereas the turn, we're really thinking about good OESDs plus as a semi-bluff region the majority of the time. There will be exceptions, there will be spots where gut shots raise, but keep in mind, most of the OESDs don't even raise. This is still fairly low frequency. Something like a dominated flush draw can be fine. We know that technically a dominated flush draw doesn't really want to play a large pot, but it is something that is consistently check raised by solver, the lower end of the flush draw continuing range. Although we saw in this particular case, that was flush draw plus. So it's going to be something like a flush draw plus a dominated gut shot. There will be other models that you run where it's just purely a baby flush draw that check raises. It's not necessarily a flush draw with a gut shot or with a pair. It's just a weak flush draw that check raises with some frequency as a semi-bluff. Now, most of the other check raising range is in the value region. It's going to be 2 pair type stuff. To give you a rough idea, the value check raising range starts around king 8. So remember, we're playing on a king 9-8 flop with a 4 turn. So king 8 is top and third pair. It doesn't always raise. So holdings like king 8 should also be mixed into the calling range. This means that king 9 is obviously strong enough to raise as well. Now you might think, well, what about stronger holdings? What about sets? Well, in the particular solver model that we've run in the background, there aren't actually any combos of sets. They're no longer in the range. And this makes sense when you think about being in the big blind. We've check called the king 9-8 board. Firstly, since it's big blind versus button, we would have 3-bet very aggressively with kings and 9s pre-flop. And then it's possible on the flop, if we still had pocket 8s combos left, we would have check raised these on the flop. What we find is that we often have a very capped range on blank turn cards. For example, the 4 of hearts here. A lot of our flop check calling range may have been draws. On a blank turn, we don't really improve to any strong hands. So we find that we have a capped range here. And that's why in this solver model, the strongest hand that we have is king 9. So when you think about it, we don't have a lot of value hands. We have our combos of king 9, king 8, and that's more or less it. So this is why it can be problematic to raise all of our gut shots. Assuming that we just get to this situation with all combos of queen 10 offsuit, for example, that's already 16 combos. Queen jack offsuit, that's already 16 combos. Whereas king 9, for 2 pair, we're talking about 9 combos, and king 8, another 9 combos. So if we're going to do something like try and check raise all of our queen 10, all of our queen jack, all of our OESDs, a bunch of our flush draws, our bluff raising ratio is just going to be so high compared to the value raising region. Again, that might not be an issue from a balance perspective, as mentioned, but just keep that in mind. Theoretically, there's a limit to how often we can check raise bluff here because we simply don't have that many value hands. Now, things could be different if it was a draw completing turn. Then we could have some stronger holdings. And that's why, for example, that solver is raising more aggressively on straight completing turns. It's because we do have more combos of the nuts in our range, which allows us to check raise semi-bluff more aggressively as well. But in this particular situation, we're somewhat handcuffed. We only have so many strong value hands. So that sets a limit on how often we can check raise as a semi-bluff, at least in theory land. Everything else in the middle is not really raised very much. It may potentially raise at a low frequency, but it's really more of a semi-bluff, or you could think of it as a protection raise. For example, a holding like King Queen, which is top pair second kicker, does actually raise with a low frequency, but the frequency is so low that we may as well just ignore it for all intents and purposes. What this means is any King X is going to be a slam dunk call against the second barrel. So as a rough guide, you really don't want to be folding top pair against the second barrel. That's usually a mistake. And when we get to second pair, this is a decision point. We don't typically want to be folding second pair against a double barrel. Now, it does depend on the situation, and it does depend on other variables such as opponent sizing. So what we find is that there are situations where it is correct to fold second pair on the turn against a double barrel, whereas there are other situations where it may be correct to defend third pair, in other words, even wider than 9x. We often find as well, solver mixes between pairs of different rank for balance reasons. In other words, in this solver model, the solver does a decent amount of folding with 9x. It probably defends most of the time, but it also folds quite a few 9x holdings. But it actually defends 8x with a fairly reasonable frequency as well. Now, this doesn't really make sense for a human to sometimes fold a 9x and sometimes defend an 8x, unless of course that 8x has a flush draw to go with it, for example. Generally speaking, if we want to defend 9x, it makes more sense to defend all of our 9x and then afterwards decide if we can dig deep enough to defend some 8x combos as well. Defending some 9x and some 8x is so ridiculously balanced that it just doesn't make sense from a human perspective. But just keep in mind that this is something that solver does. On average, in human land, so we're not thinking about the balanced theory-oriented approach, try and avoid folding second pair against a double barrel. If a bunch of draws complete on the turn, it can be correct to fold second pair, that's fine. However, on draw bricking turns, for example, like in this model, we had King 9-8 with a 4 turn. Because our opponent still has all of the live draws in his range, not only should we typically defend every 9x, every second pair, but we should also defend a decent chunk of our 8x as well. It may not be every 8x. We might think about the side card when making the decision, but on draw bricking turns, we actually want to dig deep and defend some of our third pair combos as well against the double barrel in this scenario. But in Solverland, it's just a real mixture across the 9x and 8x region. Some 9x are folding, some 8x are calling. There isn't really any raising that goes on in this region, and if there is, it's at a super low frequency. The only category we didn't touch on so far is ace high. So we have holdings like ace jack. Those are going to be fairly straightforward folds. We also have ace high flush draws, which are typically strong enough to check call. They are falling into the category of flush draw plus because they have the ace high to go with them. But some of the ace high flush draws are check raised with some frequency. For example, ace deuce of diamonds. Okay, let's see if we can summarize everything here. So we have a clear value region that starts somewhere around 2 pair, although that will vary depending on the exact run out. And we have a clear semi-bluff region. The semi-bluff region does not contain any total garbage and typically starts somewhere around the OESD and weaker flush draw region. Gut shots a lot of the time should be pure folds, although you may find on very dry runouts where we don't have any OESDs or flush draws that the gut shots may formulate part of the semi-bluff raising range. But in a situation like this where we have lots of flush draws and we have lots of gut shots really aren't worth that much and typically just fold against a double barrel here. So we do want a check raise semi-bluffing range, usually going to be weaker flush draws and OESDs. Having said that, we have to be a little bit careful with the frequency. Even if we might get away with always check raising these types of hands against some opponents, because we're very often capped in terms of the value hands that we can have, given that we just smooth called the flop against the c-bet, we can only get away with semi-bluff raising so aggressively. Otherwise, we just end up with way more bluff combos than value combos. Anything in the middle, so we really mean anything that's top pair, second pair, or third pair, is usually going to be a check call. The top pair is nearly always a continue against the second barrel. The second and third pairs are the decision points. We can usually get away with folding some second pair type hands if it's a draw completing turn, whereas if it's a draw bricking turn, not only should we always defend second pair, but we should even defend some third pairs as well. Either way, the average result is the same, which is we should be very reluctant to fold second pair when facing a second barrel in a single raise heads up pot OOP as a general principle. Having said that, nothing in the mid region really ever check raises. If it does, it's a super low frequency, and one could argue that's to do with the solve accuracy rather than it being correct to actually check raise these hands with any frequency. Now, we've just looked at one spot. Obviously, there are a large number of different flop and turn combinations. Hopefully, this gives you a picture of what the average looks like. But it might be a good idea if you have the resources to run some additional models for a different flop with a different turn, or even take this same flop and experiment with some different turn cards to see how the check raising strategy changes as a result. All right, hopefully this gave you something to think about. Thanks very much for listening. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.